Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Smith. I manage our grid operations and planning research area at EPRI. We'll be switching gears a little bit for the next 2 hours. Going to be giving also, obviously focusing on forecasting, but mostly from the distribution planning perspective. We've heard a lot about propensity modeling and top-down forecasts, that sort of thing. So this panel is specifically focusing on forecasting from a distribution planning perspective, where things have to be a lot more granular. We've talked about, you've heard things about feeder level, that sort of thing. We definitely have to get down to the feeder level, maybe even sub-feeder level, definitely the substation level, where location's king. You could talk about scenarios, but if you're not considering where things are located specifically in a more granular fashion, doesn't really matter too much for distribution planning. So really excited about sort of switching gears a little bit and giving a slightly different perspective around the forecasting. Have a number of panelists here from Darrin Kinney from Integral Analytics, who's going to talk a little bit about the work that they've been doing with their load steer tool, working specifically with a lot of utilities around North America. Then we'll move on to Julieta Giraldez, who's actually, you heard a little bit, some of the study that they did with some of the California utilities. She's going to unpack some of that a little bit more as it relates to how they were developed, some of the models that were used in the load forecast, as well as some of the grid impact work as well from a distribution perspective. And then Andy from Itron is going to go into a little bit more detail in terms of how weather impacts load, climate, as well as some of the work that you guys are doing around EV modeling as well, I believe. And then Ryan Hinkley from National Grid sort of going to back cleanup for us. Ryan's a distribution planner at National Grid, and he sort of sits in between the distribution planners and the forecasting team as it relates to helping translate some of these more advanced forecasting approaches that are being developed at National Grid and making it more applicable for distribution planning. And so he's going to speak about what they're doing there and some of the challenges there as well. So I'm going to hand it off to Darrin Kinney from Integral Analytics, and he's going to step us through for the next couple of minutes. So Darrin, floor's yours.
Do I need to turn this thing? One moment. Check, 1, 2. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Is everyone still awake? No. Okay, good. My name's Darrin Kinney. I'm the Senior Vice President of Business Development at Integral Analytics. I'm also a recovering distribution planner. Worked for many years as a distribution planner at a couple of different utilities, both investor-owned and municipal. I've kind of straddled both sides of the fence here, consumer of some of these products, and now on the vendor side. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about some of the things that we've seen working with some of our customer utilities, just some of the day-to-day challenges that they face. Not so much looking at the details of analysis and forecasting and all that, but just some of the challenges that they actually have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So this, a lot of the stuff in this slide's been talked about to death, but some of the challenges in the industry are, uncertain demand patterns. It comes from all the different end users that we're trying to model: demand response, shifting behaviors, EV charging, work from home, building electrification, all the different data, all the different shapes that we're working to integrate into these forecasts, and then managing all of the data. There's just reams and reams of data. Everything's 8760 hourly now, or even more granular than that. You got scenarios and reporting to deal with, just tons of data. And then integrating DER into the grid, that's been talked about to death too. I think we all have some good ideas about the challenges there. Intermittent and variable generation, how it impacts the grid from a technical standpoint, analyzing all this stuff under different scenarios. A lot of stuff going on there. And then we have these new changing regulatory environments. Every state's different. You go to the South, you see one thing. You go to the Pacific Northwest, you're seeing something different. So having tools that can cover all of that is a challenge. We got tariffs, incentives, regulations, policies, all of these things going into these new forecasts. Something that's kind of kind of propped up recently is a scenario design. It's kind of a new paradigm to a lot of these planning groups. And they're looking for guidance on how to put these scenarios together. It's a new skill set. They're struggling with it, at least in my experience. And then change management, moving from old ways of doing things to new ways of doing things. It's a pretty big deal for a lot of these distribution planning groups. And they want some shepherding on how to do all of this stuff. And then lack of standards. I think we can all agree that there aren't a lot of standards around this stuff. And we need to work towards developing some of those. So our philosophy at IA, for our guiding lights, is that the T&D planner has the most to lose, and we need to play defense. Whoa. Falling apart here. All right. So, yeah, T&D planning, they have the most to lose. They're the ones that, if something goes wrong, they're the ones that are held responsible. You get a plan wrong. I mean, you get something like a corporate forecast wrong. Maybe your rates aren't covering, your rates aren't designed right. You get the T&D plan wrong. There are real consequences to that. So we're on the side of the planners. And then we need to marry the top-down forecast with the bottom-up. We've talked a lot about that. It's very important. Spatial allocations part of that, and I think some of the panelists here are going to talk about that in more detail. We need nodal analysis and valuation. We need it down to at least the feeder level. We can get it down to a line section or some device level, even better, but nodal analysis is very important. Doing the distributed DER valuation, where ought DERs go based on techno-economic analysis. This is increasingly important. Another one of our guiding lights is flexibility in forecasting and planning. There's a whole bunch of data out there. We need to be able to integrate that into some sort of framework and process that stuff and get it into deliverables and reports that planners can actually use. We need to remain flexible enough to integrate with all this data and all these systems. One system's not going to do it all. There are a lot of tools that exist already, and we need to integrate with those. We need stakeholder collaboration. It's not just the planning group working in a vacuum anymore. There are a lot of silos at the utilities. Got the integrated resource planning group, got the corporate forecasting group, got the program design group, all trying to work together now to row the boat in the same direction. And then, like I said earlier, change management is another big deal we see in with a lot of these deployments. So some of the new things going into the analysis, we've talked about it a lot already. We've got, your traditional statistics, and then geospatial statistics becoming even more important, techno-economic analysis, GIS stuff. It's the backbone of everything. Maps. It's very important to have all this data mapped. I talked a little bit earlier about scenario design, how to integrate policies and regulations into how do you translate those into load shapes, how do you place those things, all of that very important. Statistical end uses, there are billions of them now, I'm exaggerating, but for every scenario, there's 5 or 6 load shapes that you're trying to model, maybe even more. And managing all of those things is really a challenge. Spatial disaggregation, agent modeling, we've talked about that a lot, and we'll hear about that some more from the other panelists. And then utility data. You can't do forecast for a utility without using some utility data. So this is at least my philosophy personally as reforming distribution planner. So electric system planners are impacted the most. So some of the experience has shown that some of the required tools in doing some of this stuff, supervised machine learning, especially on geospatial data. Yeah, the machines can tell you a lot, but really you need a person looking over the results and doing some quality checks on some of this stuff. Again, spatial load allocation is one of the cornerstones of doing these spatiotemporal forecasts. There are a lot of different methods now. Use them. Probabilistic end use adoption, again, it goes to the building the the responses to end uses under different weather conditions and other normalizing factors. Scenario design, I repeated that the third time here. And then map management, managing all the data in the maps, super critical. There's so much of it now. And then, of course, we have to have traditional planning tools like transfers and capacity projects, this traditional T&D planning type stuff. And we want a flexible framework that we can integrate with existing industry tools. So a good framework is going to be repeatable and defensible. And these are some of the major bodies of work that's being dumped on these distribution planners who are already very taxed with a lot of stuff. And all this new stuff is getting dumped on top of them. So they're having to do things like manage all this mapped data, where new loads are coming, or speculative loads are coming, where potential new load growth points are, where no new load projects are. They're managing all of this stuff in a map. And then they're also managing the network and the nodes. So the network is, the representative of the electric infrastructure. So it is not static. It's always moving around. There are transfers, there are projects being put in, there are new banks, new transformers, new feeders being built, and managing all of that network is important. Managing shapes. Again, every scenario is going to have 4, 5, 6, 100 different end shapes. And managing all of that requires some sort of library that gets easily edited, easily applied to the different points in the map. So it's a big challenge, adds a lot of work to these already busy T&D planners. And then managing the forecasts and planning scenarios. Scenario management is a huge deal. There's a ton of data in each scenario, and it takes a ton of time to process it, curate it, run it, compute it. Takes a lot of time and effort. And then flexible data sources and reporting. It's important to be able to bring in all of the fine work that everybody in this group is doing, bringing those in to inform, integrate those into forecast results. So I want to stress again that giving the forecast planner, and I think this is really kind of a new concept in a lot of utilities, this forecast planner. This is a person, a lot of utilities don't have this yet, who's focused strictly on delivering, computing, managing scenarios and forecasts, and delivering them to the rest of the group that they can use in a curated way that they can use and apply to the distribution plan in a timely manner. Time is of the essence. Planners are busy. By the time they've finished this year's forecast, they're already working on next year's forecast. And it's something that, in my experience, they're not really totally excited about doing. So having tools and sources of data that are ready to go, ready to roll, ready to apply is very important. And these new disciplines really require some new staffing at the utility. So I'll talk a little bit about managing map data. We've got new load growth potential points, projects, adoption scoring, that's in that map. Being able to manage those things and tweak them is something that seems to be more important, having a little bit more control over that landscape of adoption potential. End use shapes, shape libraries, managing all of that data. And then something, strange I ran into the other day was, with this metadata, things you wouldn't think that were important to planners are they're really starting to try to manage in these databases, like contractual obligations to transfer load and those types of things. So contract data in the map, really, it's new stuff. So managing a network, you need to be able to edit the hierarchy and the connectivity. You need to be able to manage the settings, the capacity limits, some call them planned load limits. And then you need to manage the relationships And this is all used for the aggregation and disaggregation of loads and forecasts. Managing shapes, I've been harping on this again and again, but there's just tons of shapes. And you need some sort of system to manage that library. It's really a pain in the brain. From experience, this is very important. Every scenario, 4, 5, 6 load shapes. That's just for one scenario. That might be just one macroeconomic regional forecast that you want to disaggregate to these points using some shape. A lot of time and money goes into this. Leads me to another point that I just thought about. All of this computation with all of this data. So I think I saw somebody yesterday say they were dealing with terabytes of data. Maybe even hundreds of terabytes of data. This is true. In every scenario, you're adding all of this all of this data and all of this computational resources that are required. All the supercomputing that converts to real money, and it's not a joke. It either takes a lot of time or a lot of supercompute, and it's not cheap. So managing scenarios, this is really where the beast is. I mean, you might even have, I've got on the left here, a bunch of different data sets and considerations that go into a scenario. Macro regional forecasts. There's one for probably every type of end use that you want to analyze. You got your node selections. Where are you going to apply these things into the map? You got what load shapes do you want those points in the map to adopt? And then potential points. I guess those are the areas of where this adoption could happen. You're managing all of that stuff, and the planners, they need to pick what inputs they want to go into the scenario, and they may not even have enough experience to design these scenarios effectively on their own. So, I mean, you're adding this work to an already overtaxed group of people who are being asked to do more with less. This part right here can take a long time, and you're doing this for each, for multiple scenarios. So it's important to remain flexible, both in your inputs and outputs. You have parcel level data, you have spatial forecasts coming in from different systems. You have reporting requirements, and you have the desire to connect to other systems using APIs. You've got things like load flow tools that you want to integrate with, engineering and financial analysis. You've got energy and stats analysis you want to integrate with. And more importantly, you want to give the users the control to manage all of this stuff. So, really what we want to do to help these guys out, men and women, we want to narrow down the solution space by planning by exception. We want to give them the tools that they can speed up all this analysis with. They're not going to run a detailed analysis on every node in the system. They want to know where the hot spots are, where the problems are. We need to deliver that quickly. We need to give them planning tools, engineering and financial. So in conclusion, to really help these distribution planning groups, we need to give them scenarios that cover their risk spectrum, that give them a warm and fuzzy. By nature, they're going to be very conservative people, and they want to know what the risk spectrum is, because they're going to plan it accordingly. And we want to give them tools to manage the data, and we want to give them a high degree of control over the forecast, but make it easy at the same time. And we want to provide flexibility. That's what I have. Thanks.
Appreciate that, Darrin. I mentioned in the beginning that we're going to be switching gears a little bit and giving forecasting from a distribution planner's perspective. So Darrin did a really good job at painting a picture of what distribution planners are faced with today. They do have to wear multiple hats, being asked to do multiple things. And in some cases, we're giving them a lot of data. In some cases, they don't have actionable data. So you're going to hear a little bit about from Julieta and Andy about some of the things that they're doing actually to help develop some of these forecasting tools. And then Ryan, again, is going to wrap up sort of talking about how distribution planners are applying some of that and some of the challenges to get them to evolve so that they're using some more of these advanced forecasting solutions. So I'm going to hand it over to Julieta as soon as I get her share set up.
I'll do a sound check. Can you hear me? On the back too? Very good. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Julieta Giraldez. I'm Director of Grid Planning at Kevala. We're a software company, and we do bottom-up load NDR forecasting. That's what I'm going to talk about. It's a big deal for me to be up here. By way of background, I used to be at NREL. I like to say that I grew up there. I spent over a decade there, and all of the NREL eminences would present at ESIG, and now it's me up here. So it's a big deal. It's an honor. Thank you for having me. The second reason why it's a big deal, it's because we have a distribution panel at ESIG. Do you guys realize? Like, we're somebody, and we're very excited to be up here. So thank you, ESIG, for having us on the distribution side. So as I was saying, I'm going to talk about the approach that we took for the electrification impact study, and Troy yesterday gave a little bit of a flavor of what we did there. So we have published the part 1 bottom-up premise level load NDR adoption and system level distribution system level estimate of the cost of electrification in terms of upgrades. There's going to be a part 2 next year. Part 1 was unmitigated, and in part 2 we're going to be focusing on mitigation strategies and WA's load management techniques. So I've been taking a lot of notes of what has been discussed here, that potential to manage that load and see what we come up with next year. So what we mean by when we say at Kevala premise level is bottom-up load NDR forecasting is that we modeled every single of the premises in the state of California for the 3 main IOUs, so most of the state. And we did load NDR adoption at that premise level. And the results that we came up with were the 50 billion number for cost of electrification by 2035. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of how we came up with that. Before I go into that, I wanted to mention a little bit about the scope of the study. So we looked at distribution and secondary upgrades. So one of the benefits of doing premise level is that we can look at aggregation from the service transformer, serving a few customers all the way up to distribution. But there's really no reason why we couldn't keep going up. And so I wanted to already, Josh, I have another volunteer, I'm volunteering another topic of discussion for the load NDR task force. There's no reason why we couldn't go up. And so I've been thinking a lot about hearing all of this session, the ISOs, and now we're going to talk about distribution, both moving to bottom-up load NDR forecasting, hourly weather-driven models, versus what used to be done before, right? The ISO is focused on energy and then peak models, distribution only cared about peak. Now they're both moving to the same. And so am I crazy in thinking that we could only do this once and do a single load and DR forecast from the bottom up? And the reason why I think that's critical is not just because it may save a lot of people some time, but it is what keeps me up at night is the disaggregation steps that we are doing. So the ISOs have really improved their bottom-up capability, but then the disaggregation to bus loads, John, you mentioned this yesterday, is done by average, load shares or historical peak, and that keeps me up at night. I feel like we could carry these bottom-up and geospatial all the way up to do that better. The same for distribution. A lot of the disaggregation is done, in a peanut butter way. And I think that is also very dangerous as we go into a future world of lumpy cluster DER adoption. So the method that we took here in the EIS study, I think it's novel in 2 ways. One, because we looked at the long term, and in distribution planning, we typically don't do that. We've never had to. We've never had a really good reason why. Beyond 5 years, it was too uncertain, and distribution planning typically had time to react to the load that was coming. But now, the game is changing. And so we think it's really critical to start the conversation on years 5 to 10 and 10 to 15, so we can coordinate the solutions between transmission and distribution into how we're going to respond to this load. The second is because we did this bottom up, we were able to look at the secondary service transformers that do exist, and we're going to have to replace them. So we came up with a cost for those. The LA 100 study was the only one that had, looked at those for the first time. And we did that too. And then we shy away from the world of load shape assumptions. By modeling at the premise level, we can really model the behavior of each customer, the sizing, the output, the behavior, and really understand what's going to happen if we change, if we affect that behavior. So I think that's also really powerful. And so in these steps, we started with a baseline load forecast, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we did that. It was AMI driven. So each premise had its AMI weather dependent driven model, over which we overlaid the demand side modifiers, very similar to approaches that a lot of you have presented. And then that was aggregated from the premise to the service transformer and all the way up. And then the last step was we did a capacity thermal evaluation. So we compared the loads that we came up with at each of these assets to the thermal ratings, calculated the overload, and with that, we estimated at a high level what new infrastructure would be needed to meet that load and associated a unit cost. And that's how we came up with the $50 billion number, of which 15 billion alone is the secondary service infrastructure. So on the baseline load, I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this because I feel like what we've done is actually pretty unique. We were able to leverage the AMI data from the IOUs. And so instead of energy or just a peak model, we did an hourly model. That was this first step. The baseline net load was dependent on the learnings. It was a machine learning model that learned the response of every premise to historical load. But then I think what we did that was pretty novel too, is that to carry it forward, instead of doing a 1 in 10 or a 50-50, we used a climate model. And I have the notes here, representative concentration pathway climate model. And it's a climate change model. And so we actually modeled the response of these premises based on how they responded to temperature, but using a climate change future weather scenario. So I thought that, that I had never really seen it done in that way before at the address specific level. What we did after that is we disaggregated the PV. We had the interconnection PV records. We use NREL's PV watts to calculate the gross load. We had to do it, I think, really because it would feed some of the DR adoption models that we used to calculate payback period. And so we wanted to disaggregate the PV to learn from that adoption. That step is going to become tricky. And I think maybe Andy's going to talk more about that as EV ramp ups and other DRs. If we're going to have to do that disaggregation more, that's going to be tricky. So we had the weather dependent model. And the last things we added was load growth. So 2 sources of load growth that we added over the weather dependent. The known loads, which is the new prospective businesses that utilities know have requested in new interconnection at a feeder specific level. So we added those. But then we also added unknown load growth. And that came from the Caltrans socioeconomic forecast. And so by sector, we added premises that we allocated to the feeder level. And that step is also very important for the unknown load growth, because then by adding new premises, we were also able to add new adopters of technology. And that really helps you with doing the more granular spatial of how the DRs are actually going to be adopted when you add new load growth. So again, not necessarily an energy or a peak. It was a full hourly load carried through 2035. In here, we've talked a lot about this, so I'm going to be brief on this. And Troy presented our EV specific model, but we followed these sort of steps: size, behavior, adoption, and target. And every DR has wonderful and beautiful and long dedicated appendix in the report. You're more than welcome to go there. We still haven't found one person. Everybody, says, "Oh, great report. I haven't read it all, but I want to get there." So if anybody has read it all, you might be the first person. The adoption model at the premise level, I wanted to focus a little bit on adoption and target, because I think those steps are very important as we start talking about top down and bottom up and how we reconcile those two. We actually took somebody today mentioned, I think his name was Ryan from Evolve. He mentioned the backcasting approach. And that's sort of what we did for the first time, right? Distribution planning has never typically done a policy-driven forecast, right? They used to just do historical. They didn't really have that need. But it is very important to start taking these backcasting. I really like that description approach. And that's what we did. The adoption step, what it basically does is it ranks all of the premises by their likelihood to adopt a certain technology. And then you want to hit a certain target. So we were not necessarily the forecasters of the technologies. We took targets in California to meet the 2035 state goals. And for example, for EVs, it was number of cars. For PV was installed capacity. And we drew the line of adopters to meet that target. And so that's how we sort of marry a top-down target, but it's disaggregated in a bottom-up way. And I think that's what's critical to do. And this is sort of an illustration of how we do this in our platform. So this is sort of like how we represent things in our platform. You see over there, the gray boxes are the parcels, and the dots are different DERs that get adopted. And the step is critical because what we want to avoid is peanut buttering down to feeder or substation the DERs. And it can really dilute the lumpiness or the clusters of technology adoption that are really going to drive those grid requirements. So this is how we do, we approach this. This is the illustration of a regional forecast that will be allocated down. And then you can aggregate back up to any infrastructure level that you want, to the feeder, to the substation, or even further up. In terms of infrastructure upgrades, how we did this is as I was saying, we calculated the coincident peak load at every one of the asset levels of the grid. So starting by, the service transformers, they peak all at different times, different than the feeders, than the substation banks. And we came up with a way of simplifying, the way distribution planning makes decisions for what new infrastructure might be needed. And that's how we came up then with the requirements for new infrastructure, and then calculated the unit costs of that new infrastructure that was needed to come up with that total number. Most studies that you see that you have seen on electrification have looked at feeders or substations. Nobody had ever really looked at the service transformers except the LA 100 study. But again, not a non-negligible part of proactive planning that I think we need to think about. These are the scenarios. I'm not going to go into any detail, but they were policy driven. So it was that backcasting approach of wanting to reach a certain targets. And the scenarios were around transportation electrification, so number of cars, and NEM tariffs. So how much it would change if we change the NEM tariff. So connecting to the previous panel, these models where they're connected to rates, they really help understand the behavioral changes that can affect adoption. So no surprise here, very similar numbers to other electrification studies that have been presented before. Significant peak change in 2030, but especially in 2035, along with a change in peak load time. In this case, most of the DRs were responded to existing time of use. And changing the behind the meter rate did not really affect that much the results. The second result is a significant increase in energy sales. And I wanted to connect this a little bit with the panel that we had yesterday where Gerhard from Eversource said, that we're a little bit in a blocked, position between the regulatory and the utilities, in which, there is some now more a certainty that we're going to have an increase in sales. And so we may be able to spend more. And so this $50 billion, while it seems, very large, the implications on rates are yet to be known, right? You can do the back of the envelope calculation of the energy increase and the total. It doesn't necessarily mean that rates will go up. I think the important thing is that we may not have time to build all that infrastructure on time. And so, yes, we need to think about mitigation strategies, but also mostly about solutions that are going to bridge the gap while we build that infrastructure, both for distribution and transmission. And I think that's where the big coordination needs to happen. So this is the hockey stick, of upgrade costs that we've shown. It's not the same actually for the 3 IOUs. Some of them are more linear and some of them are really more of this hockey stick shape. But what I wanted to contrast this is with the next slide. This is the hockey stick shape of upgrade costs and grid needs that we see. This is the shape of the planned investments forecasted by the 3 utilities in California. So consistently over the forecast horizon, so what they filed in 2020, what they filed in 2021, and what they filed in 2022, it seems to be reactive, right? They're able to react to the short term, to what's needed in the next 2-3 years. But beyond year 4, it seems like we consistently are unable to proactively look at that. It also happens at the timing then to implement, new solutions that we are all learning about, like DRs and NWAs, take some time. And so there's a mismatch now of when we're able to plan for the infrastructure versus when we're able also to consider alternative solutions. And this is mostly driven by the way distribution planning has been responding to these grid needs, which is responding to the known loads or the new prospective businesses that, give a heads up, I'm gonna need to interconnect, and the utility has time to respond. But you can already see in the bottom graph there, I am showing the known loads that the utilities knew about in 2019, then in 2020, and in 2022. And so you can see in 2019, what the known loads reflect in 2022 was off by a lot. And so these bottom-up load NDR forecast and more geospatial and granular and locational, I think is key to not just respond to the new service requests, but be able to anticipate. And gaps and opportunities here. We published a report with NREL looking at mapping the existing distribution planning process. And a lot of these things that I've mentioned are more common than one would think across the utility practices. And some gaps and opportunities that we found, I think we've all, are going to say the same thing, but it's long-term scenario modeling. We cannot keep doing single point forecast at the distribution level, to make a decision on whether we should upgrade or do a solution in an area or not. We need to start embracing the world of scenario and probabilistic methods. And really the compute environment, while yes, it does, it costs a lot, we have now access to this massive compute power. So I think we are ready to start tackling and making decisions a little bit more informed by different scenarios and probabilistic methods. The last thing that I think it's important is the objective metrics, new planning metrics. So we've always looked at typically thermal and voltage. And while those two are, yes, the physical principles of what the grid needs to operate, now we're planning to meet decarbonization goals. And so why wouldn't we include other metrics in the planning processes, like hosting capacity, like equity, enabling decarbonization, in making these decisions on what the best solution might be for an area, infrastructure, or a combination of both to meet those goals. And I think I'm still doing pretty good on time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about equity. And I think this was mentioned in the previous panel, right? Because we're now going to that customer level and matching all of the consumption data and the grid data with the socioeconomics for these adoption models, we also have the opportunity to start looking at equity with where those gaps are. We calculate the rate, for example, for determining PV and storage adoption. And so we can also calculate things like electricity burden. And so I think it is becoming more of a reality that we can start considering these metrics at the distribution level. And I'll finish by saying, to bring it all home, that it is very important that we start anticipating what's coming, to build the right infrastructure and at the right place. But as I was saying, also to really start thinking about those solutions when the infrastructure is not going to be able to be built on time, both at the transmission and distribution. And I keep mentioning transmission because I feel like as we try to connect them more, both a little bit more, but we're still very siloed, right? And so distribution, when transmission power or supply is not going to be able to get there, they say, well, that's a transmission issue. And while that is right, the power is still not getting to the customers. So there might be a solution that can be implemented at the distribution level to that provides kilowatt hours. That's not a transformer that might be able to solve that, be a bridge. And so we need to start thinking a little bit more about that. I feel like Europe is more advanced in that way. They have what they call the flexibility markets, which are really effectively markets to manage congestion between distribution and transmission. And I think that we need to start thinking about that to mitigate the cost, but really to start tackling this concept of congestion management solutions in the US. And I think I've already said this, but we are going to have to, we've talked a lot about the opportunity to manage this load. But I still think like we're at the infancy of understanding that. And we think that, we really need to understand how customers are, how we're going to be able to affect their behavior, and model that from the bottom up to see how we can manage that load and be able to affect it at the local level and then bring it all back up to more flexibility for the ISO. And I'll finish there with 10 seconds.
Rest.
Great.
Very good.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Julieta. We'll switch gears a little bit and I get the slide up. Andy from Itron is going to speak a little bit about what they've been doing around forecasting at the distribution level. Getting into something around climate impacts, weather normalization, how that's affecting some of the load changes, as well as some of the EV forecasting. So, floor is yours.
Thank you. Let's see if I get this. Okay, cool. How's my volume? Good, thanks. So today I'm going to be talking about integrating the top level corporate forecast with distribution planning forecasts. So just to provide a little bit of background, at Itron and formerly Regional Economic Research, we've been in the long-term forecasting business for roughly 40 years. And throughout this time, we've really supported corporate forecasting. And so that includes really in the long term, looking at resource adequacy on the generation side, transmission, capacity expansion. And we also convert that to dollars in terms of budgeting. But in recent years, we've been involved in several projects where the corporate forecasting team has come in and asked us to help them better, work a little bit better with the distribution planners. So we've worked with them to kind of synchronize the processes and build in the appropriate structure such that we can produce consistent results. So this is an example of one of our recent engagements. So we worked with Detroit, the DT Energy last year. This was really a year-long project to try to get their feeder level forecast to align with the system forecast. So this is a comparison. So here in the royal blue, we have our bottom up feeder level forecast. And in the light blue, we have the top level system forecast. So you can see throughout really the peak month, we're pretty well aligned. In fact, on the peak day, we're within about 1 to 2% throughout the day. Talk a little bit about how we got there. So really we needed to work with the planners, distribution planners, get them to work closely with, the corporate forecasters, but also bring in some data scientists as well as subject matter experts. And then I think our expertise comes in terms of embedding the right structure, both into the corporate forecasting framework, as well as the distribution planning framework. So I'll dive into that a little bit here. So if you think about forecasting in the simplest form, you're really answering two questions. And the first question is, where are we? Or what is our current level? And this involves in developing an in-depth understanding of the baseline loads. And this is something we've done for years and years for the ISOs, for the utilities at a high level. And we've been successful as well, bringing that down to the feeder level. So this is just an example of daily peaks for a decent sized feeder, about 11 MVA in size. So we're looking at the peaks against temperature, and the points are color coded by day type. So pretty well behaved at this level. And what we've done here is leverage a machine learning artificial neural network model, which enables us to build a unique multi-part weather response function to capture both the heating and cooling loads. We're able to augment that to capture the unique response by node and by hour. So here we're looking at just midnight. So we'll move through kind of the late night hours. Not too exciting, but bear with me here. We get to the early morning, late morning, midday. And here we're approaching our peak. So this model specification or feature engineering, depending on if you're an econometrician or data scientist, same idea, is something we've evolved over years and years, really working at higher level data. So we start with, this is a look just optically at the coincident temperature for the same hour, but really we have a rolling lag structure that we layer through. So we're looking at different period lags to capture the heat buildup effect, because it takes a while for the billing shell to actually heat up and feel what's coming in from outside. Additionally, we'll look at offsets. This particular feeder is residential dominant, so you don't see much difference between the slope when we look at the weekdays versus the weekends, but we're able to capture those offsets for the more non-residential dominant circuits. In addition, we'll look at impacts of wind and clouds, enabling us to be very accurate at the feeder level. So just perpetuating through the day here. Oh, 1 sec. Sorry. Now we're moving into the evening hours and just looking at accuracy in terms of the feeder summer peak. We look at other metrics in terms of the load duration curve, but overall just our median MAPE across all the 3,000 feeders was about 3.3%. And, of course, the higher accuracy, the 75th percentile accuracy is about 1.6, 25th, 5.9%. Anyone that's worked with these data will acknowledge that there's data issues. And so we scrub the data, but there's certain feeders that are just difficult to model, whether that be because the data quality is poor or just the nature of the load itself. But in terms of the mean absolute deviation, this kind of relativizes it. We're off just shy of 0.1 MVA. This equates to 10 Teslas that are plugged in at level 2. So it just kind of relativizes and for DT Energy, they had about 650 customers on a circuit. So we're pretty accurate in that context with the feeder level approach. Just looking at climate change trends, as Arthur mentioned, we did climate change study with them, looking at the trends, not just in terms of annual CDDs and HCDs, but also at time of peak and at different junctures on the temperature duration curve. So this all gets embedded into the long-term forecast. And additionally, we're going to wrap kind of our band around that, the 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 weather. So for right now, just focus on the cooling side. In this particular area, heating wasn't a big issue. They're just all natural gas. But we'll look at how that plays out. So coming back to the peak hour here, if you just focus in on this yellow rectangle in the upper right-hand quadrant, I'm just going to blow this up so we can zoom in a little bit deeper. And so through our artificial neural network models, we're actually able to capture the derivative in 5-degree buckets so that we can take that neural network model and embed it into a linear regression framework. And the reason we do that is because it enables us to better extrapolate. Neural networks, due to their functional form, can actually be relatively poor at extrapolation, where the derivative will actually turn over. So we apply a little bit of heuristics or judgment here based on our experience to really trust this prevailing slope and see what it's going to do when we extend out and layer in a 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 scenario. So this is repeated for every node and every hour, okay? And now if we look at these resulting peaks, we're looking at 1 in 2 coming in at 11 MVA, and then in 1 in 20, we're at 13.2. So just in context, where our model error was 10 Teslas at level 2, the jump from a 1 in 2 to 1 in 20 on the circuit is equivalent to 240 Teslas being plugged in. So we want to make sure we're accurate when we go to take that jump from 1 in 2 to 1 in 20. And this needs to be nailed down on an hourly basis because we're going to see the peak shift as the other DERs come online. So this is what we get kind of as a result. This is just the corresponding baseline shapes on the peak day. So in pink, we have the 1 in 2 or the base case. In red, we have the 1 in 10. And then in maroon, we have the 1 in 20. This is a great place to start. But of course, we know that this is going to change with time. A couple of factors, some of which we mentioned, others which we may haven't. On the heating side, of course, fantastic panel this morning on looking at the different building electrification shapes with the alternative backup fuels, how that looks. On the cooling side, of course, some of those, you have competing effects there, perhaps increases in saturation, fighting it out with increases in efficiency. So we look at that. In addition, one concept that hasn't been mentioned is kind of interactive effect of solar. So we layer in our solar, right? And that's going to obviously have an effect. The solar output's going to push down on the load. But what also happens if we look at it is there's another effect where the CDD slope steepens. And that's because of this effect, this power is effectively free in the eyes of the consumer. So we need to embed that in going forward so that we adjust this weather response. So we're going to see additional weather response from these other factors and their appropriate interactions. This is something that's easier discerned at kind of a higher level. So that's the first question. Where are we? Right? Next question. Where are we going? Perfect. I'm about 10 minutes. So I got through the first question. Second question. All right. Where are we going? Components of change. Fortunately, we've been talking about this for 2 days. So, so I can kind of pick and choose what I want to talk about, which is kind of nice. But anyway, so this is our forecast waterfall that we put forth for the corporate forecasters, and it's all built on our statistically adjusted end use modeling framework, which I'll get into deeper tomorrow. But just for right now, acknowledge it's a comprehensive framework that's going to integrate changes in equipment stock, changes in the thermal shell, behavioral changes, for example, economics, price, Google mobility, and additionally, of course, the new technologies. And given its linear regression framework, we're able to iteratively run these simulations to disaggregate the results any way we might want. And so as a part of this engagement, we worked with the corporate forecasters and the distribution planners to determine the components of change that they want to isolate. And these are what we're looking at here. So if we start with the 2022 sales, this first bar is just an adjustment of weather normalization. So this, you could think of this persisting with our weather normalized 2022 volume just through time. We layer in the customer growth. That's kind of the parcels of land. New projects will come in the non-residential. This would be like a new Walmart, a strip mall. Solar PV here, of course, there's two effects here, right? You have the production pushing down, but we also need to account for the steepening in the CDD and perhaps even HCDs. EVs, I'm going to talk about more in depth in a minute. Of course, we have storage, EE, electrification, demand response, and then this last piece, other. These are all the other effects. This would be where the economics comes in, price, Google mobility data, plug loads. Now, sometimes these counterbalance, but not always. Sometimes they don't, and so we need to make sure we capture this effect as well. So I'm going to drill in a bit into this EV segment because it's the largest segment for one, and for two, there's a couple concepts. While we've dug in deep on multiple levels, I think there's a couple items that we yet to discuss. So of course, we have a broad scope here. Jeremiah did a tremendous job yesterday walking us through the EV fleet. So we're looking at that, with pretty deep segmentation. And then on the passenger vehicle side, in Detroit, this is where they're really concerned, and particularly these level 2 shapes. So we start with the NREL EVI Pro Lite data. That's a great default. But where available, we either layer in telematics, or we have machine learning algorithms that can disaggregate using telematics as a source of truth for the sample, and then train the models to isolate the EV load using AMI data for a population. But what was even better in this case was we actually had sub-meter data for DTE energy. And this is where we can really begin to tease out some of the charging strategies. So here we're looking at, there's a sample of about 1,200 customers on an EV rate where the off-peak period was from 11 p.m. to 9 in the morning. All these customers are on level 2 charging. There's a relatively gentle price differential. On peak is twice the off-peak price. In San Diego, it's actually 6-to-1, so this is relatively gentle. And here we're looking at an example of one customer monthly data. Now, this customer charges relatively infrequently. You can see there's probably about 10 charging events that are relatively longer in duration. What we found is this is most common. Customers are charging relatively infrequently on average. Down here is an example of a customer that's going to charge every day. Perhaps when they come home, just fill up till they're full charge, and that's why you see these kind of narrow spikes occurring every day. So begin to think about how we might stratify here. And then over here, looking at the charging strategies from another lens, this is, again, a month of data, but each day is overlaid, okay? So here we're looking at a customer that's plugging in at 11 p.m. every night and plugging in until they reach full charge. This charging strategy down here at the bottom, I actually kind of like is what we're calling the charge by strategy, where these customers program their car such that it's plugged in by 7 a.m. So the car knows how much time do I have? I have 4 minutes, but the car knows in 26 seconds. But the car here has, it's going to acknowledge, okay, when do I need to begin charging such that I'm going to be full charge by 7 a.m. So you work backwards depending on the state of charging the battery, and this creates a kind of staggered shape through the middle of the night. So how do we layer that in to the long-term forecast? Well, at the system level, this is relatively easy in that we can look at, okay, we have our charging strategy. So for example, this orange shape, if I look at Monday, this is where we're plugging in at 11 p.m. and plugging in until we're full charge. The green is that charge by strategy. And then in red, we have the immediate strategy. These are customers that are not on TOU. They're just going to plug in when they get home from work. And then the gray is kind of a flatter version of the red. So we can take a weighted average of these strategies to thereby construct our long-term shape for the system level. Now, this is nice, but it actually may not help us when we start to look at the low voltage network. And here's why. So the other advantage of the sample data is that we were able to look at a little bit of bootstrapping, look at samples of different sizes, and then look at the peak per port. So if we think of just one vehicle, depending on the amperage, you're going to see peaks of 7 for like 30 amps, 9 for 40, and about 11 for 50. But for right now, just consider a peak per port of about 9. But what we see when we start adding in ports, we see the peak per port decline, right? So we're adding in diversity here. And so when we think about the low voltage network, we need to make sure we account for that lack of diversity. This is particularly an issue at the transformer level because we're somewhere in here between 1 and 5. Now at the feeder level, it ended up being less of an issue. In fact, the diversity increased a little bit quicker than I might have thought. But what we're able to do is look at constructing these different shapes based on the number of ports that are on the feeder, or this an extension of this would be at the transformer level, to construct a peakier shape for those early cars that come online. So what we do is we take a weighted average of these shapes given the different sample sizes, and this is going to give us our shape at the feeder level. So this was just I think a concept that we maybe touched on very briefly but didn't get into in depth. Okay, a minute 30 seconds. All right, so presenting the forecast. So this is to the point where we're looking at uncertainty, and ultimately we pulled this together based on what the DTE Energy planners had requested, and what they wanted was the ability to see the forecast for each node in terms of the annual peak here that we have to the top right. Look at the peak day on the summer and winter, toggle across the years, and then isolate each of those contributing factors that we saw in the waterfall, further breaking out the EVs. And then they said, okay, we want the ability to flex each of these inputs such that, we can construct, whatever scenario we might want and see the results in real time. And so we put this together for them so they basically can pull any of the forecasts in, whether it be for a feeder, bus bar, or substation, and then flex any of the inputs, see the results, and apply their judgment. And so this is a kind of another way to address the whole topic of uncertainty. At 31 seconds stopped. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Well, in 30 seconds. So, this is a complex problem. Just the transition to decarbonization, and it's just been a fantastic conference. The level of depth and research on each of these layers is just phenomenal. And my opinion is that, we really need to team up to pull together each piece and really work together to ultimately come together with a solution that's going to work both at the power system level and then at various levels on, distribution system. So, thank you.
Great. Excellent.
All right. Yeah.
Picked up on the theme here. There's a theme around timing matters for distribution. So we're staying on target here because when things happen really, really are critical for distribution. All right, I'm gonna hand it over to Ryan, who's gonna sort of bring it home from a distribution. So he's done a reformed distribution planner. He is a distribution planner.
Yes.
Right. Giving a perspective from National Grid. So really appreciate you joining with us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I do believe on the agenda, there's nothing after me, so I have as long as I want. Oh, no. Honestly, thank you ESIG for having me here. It's been a great conference. Really love diving in and seeing all the different forecasting around the country, around the world. And it's exciting, but also very scary from my perspective. My job, what I do is I do short-term planning. That's 6 months out, not a week, not 2 weeks, 6 months out to 10 years out, long-term planning. I also do new interconnections, whether it's a DG, an EV, just a normal Tim Hortons or Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts across, just all these different things. That's what I'm dealing with on a regular basis. But when we really need to plan our system, we got to have a good forecast. If I'm allowing something to connect, I need to see what the potential issues are going down. So just kind of an overview of National Grid. This is our service territory in New York State and Massachusetts. The green is the electric. We also have some gas as well. Rhode Island, we ended up selling about a year ago, but the map's not updated yet. But yeah, my role is primarily in New York. So most of the data I'm going to be showing is from New York. But Massachusetts, they use a very similar forecast and they have very similar results as well. So high level overview of our forecast. I have all the distribution planning hats that I wear, but I also wear another hat where I'm a major stakeholder that interfaces between our planning engineers as well as our forecasting team. So this is what's the big part of our forecast. We have a bottom up and a top down approach. So bottom up, we go to the premises. We see what type of customers are there. Is it residential? Is it commercial? We look at their roofs. Could they adopt solar? If so, how much? And then we go down to top down. Well, top down might be, okay, we have a state incentive for this many electric vehicles. They think it's going to be this much. So we'll allocate it based on the bottom up data. So it's kind of a mixture of that bottom up and the top down approach. You plug that all in, we end up getting hourly data, 8760, all the way from today through 2050. We use a 1 in 10, 90-10 weather scenario. And we also have a few different scenarios for each of those DERs. A lot of them are more based on the shifts of when do they start. Maybe there's more adoption in 2030, or maybe there's more adoption in 2035, the different types of scenarios like that. And the different DERs. So the different DERs we use: energy efficiency, solar, electric vehicles, energy storage, and electric heat pumps. And then our forecasting team, I'm not exactly sure how they do this, so I apologize, but they do assign probabilities to the different scenarios, with base being the most probable. So you can combine all that and you can have a full base scenario forecast, 28.5%. You start messing with the different toggles, you can see other percents, 8%, 7%. It just kind of goes down. So you can kind of pick and choose what you want to do. If you can tell, this is a lot of data. And as an engineer that has to work on 1,900 feeders, 650 transformers, 500 different stations, all these different probabilities, all these different scenarios, I and the rest of the engineers need to be involved from the very beginning. So how are we involved? First of all, we actually have to provide inputs to the forecast, whether it's historical loads, summer peaks, winter peaks, minimums. So the forecast we get actually look like the forecast we're going to use. We also specify what types of DERs we want. So if we want a new component or revise a component, we need to talk to them about that. We need to make sure they understand and know what we want. And then we also specify these variations of the scenarios. I mentioned the high, base, low. Most of those are based on different policies around the country, whether it be California incentives or New York incentives, trying to predict what is going to happen. This year, we are actually adding 2 more scenarios: a fossil-free vision. This is an internal vision we have at National Grid to get our system entirely fossil-free, and then a full electrification. So this is the be-all, end-all, 2050, everything's electrified. So those are the inputs, these are the outputs. So for each of those 1,900 feeders, we get one set of files. One file has the hourly data from January 1st, 2023, all the way through December 31st, 2050. We also get another file that has summary data. peaks and minimums, just to kind of help us with our analysis. But there's a lot of different components in that because we just talked about the different scenarios, and that to mention there's a base load, and then there's also some climate change elements in there too. So we actually have one column for each individual scenario. So you can try and figure out, okay, what are we going to use? Are we going to use the base here, the high EV here, the low PV here? We can combine it all and do a unique analysis on each feeder. A lot of files, so they have a portal that's created so we can retrieve those files, that type of thing. And then this is where I come in and kind of shifting that towards distribution planning. It's also not just me. I have a bunch of other engineers that help me with this. But what we do is we try to simplify it down for the general planner. Because like as my counterpart said, planners, they're used to planning for a single number every year, a single summer number. And then they were used to seeing a system level forecast. That system level forecast, just to kind of show you, all of New York State is broken up into 6 zones. Those 6 zones all have one single growth rate. So that means the city of Albany and the Adirondack Mountains would have the exact same forecast. That's not realistic. The city is going to have higher EV load growth. The Adirondack Mountains might have smaller EV, but more PV because there's more land. It's something that we really needed to get down into. So we try to simplify that using similar strategies. We get it down to a single data point that we roll out to the planners that they can work with, but it's just a little bit simpler. I'm gonna jump. Oh, cool. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of what we've done over the years, but I've noticed one thing about ESIG, my first time here, I love it. You guys all love graphs, so I have a few graphs I have to share. So this is one, once we can simplify it down to one data point per year, we can start doing some high level analysis. Right here shows how many transformer upgrades we will need going all the way from today through 2050. It's quite a lot. With 700 transformers on our system, if we didn't account for any of the electric vehicles or electric heat, we only need to upgrade like 75. But now once we start accounting for more, now we're all the way up to 250. Except we're missing one component. Our forecast doesn't have fleet electrification in there yet. We are expecting by 2050 another 40 gigawatts of fleet electrification. That's quite a lot, especially when our transformers are for 40 MVA. So that's an additional 1,000 transformers to the 250 we already need to upgrade just to serve this new load. And so that's distribution feeders, distribution stations, also transmission lines to feed those stations. There's a lot going on here, and we've been able to quantize this and figure out where it goes. And then another fun graph just to kind of show we're also worried about electric heat as well. There's a great heat electrification panel earlier with both New York and the New England ISO, which is our service territory, so it's perfect. But we are expecting a shift. We're expecting that shift on our feeders from between 2030 and 2035. Our feeders will start gradually going. But if you notice, some of them are going to start doing it sooner than later. Some of them might start doing it in 2025, 2028, just as more adoption of electric heat occurs. So we usually would only plan to like a summer peak. Now we're doing winter peaks as well. So it's twice the amount of work for our engineers. And now the hardest part, distribution planners. They've been here for 20, 30 years planning to a single value. Some of them were planning to no values at one point. How do you get them to trust this huge forecast? Goes out so far, has so many different components. So my new favorite industry standard is the crawl, walk, run approach. And that's what we did. In 2018, we rolled out our feeder level forecast. It has its bumps, and as we slowly tried to figure out how it was manageable, there was some things we need to adjust. So we used the trends. This was before electric heat and electric vehicles were really being pushed. They weren't even part of the forecast yet. So we were like, okay, you see an overload, look at the feeder level forecast. If it's increasing, make that project. If it's decreasing, you know what, let's push it out. We're going to wait a year or so and see if it's still actually an issue. A year later, a couple years later, we're like, okay, we got the forecast, it's working good now. Let's start using it. 8760 is still too much. So let's just use a single peak. So we use the base scenario. We picked out a peak for every year and started planning to that. Engineers were still a little bit more like, hey, is this real? We don't really believe in this. Why is there a huge jump in 8 years? A DC fast charger was being modeled on it now or whatever. So we still have those bumps. Now we're getting to today. We're still using that single peak, but we're using different scenarios. When we're planning for the city of Buffalo, we'll look at a high electric vehicle load. But when we're looking on the rural area, we're going to have a high solar load, maybe not as high of an electric vehicle. So we use the low electric vehicle, high solar penetration to kind of have that engineering touch and to pick the scenario of what we want to do. And then the 4th step. So we did the crawl, walk, run, but I really think the next step is fly. Fly is when we can really actually use that full hourly data to plan our system, size everything properly, whether it's adjusting our ratings to match what the new load curves are, or even just a simple idea of stuff that we have started using today and hopefully we'll continue using further. So this would be, how do you size a battery? Well, you need 3 key points, not just the size of the battery, but how often do you need that battery? Do you need it 5 times a year, 10 times a year? How long is that outage? You can look at historicals and come up with a nice estimate, but without a good hourly forecast that has the new electric vehicles and electric heat, you won't really know what that is just looking at historicals. And once again, if you go back to that traditional single point forecast, you can't. You don't know what you're actually looking at. You're only looking at historicals with a single growth rate. You really have to look at it. So kind of going back to this slide, because this is key. Distribution planners, they're stubborn, but they know a lot. They're the ones pushing projects forward. They're the ones defending the projects to the rate base, to the PSC, the regulators, trying to tell us how much we can spend, where we can spend it. So the engineers really need to buy into the forecast. I'm here, I'm bought in. Like I trust, like this is amazing. You guys are presenting incredible, scary stuff, but like, I know it's coming. Now we got to make it available for the distribution planners and earn their trust. Thank you very much.